The Ugly Duckling. Once upon a time on a country farm, a mother duck was sitting on a batch of 7 new eggs waiting for them to hatch. Soon out popped 6 ducklings, little fluffy balls of yellow down on top of tiny webbed feet. The mother duck was delighted and thought her new ducklings were the most beautiful creatures in all creation. But she was also worried. The 7th egg, the biggest egg of all, had still not hatched. She nudged it and poked it, but nothing stirred. Then finally, a beak broke through the shell. The other ducklings gathered around excitedly to watch, but their excitement soon turned to astonishment when out of the egg stumbled the strangest looking duckling they had ever seen. Instead of yellow feathers, it had grey, and as for its feet, they were hopelessly big and floppy. It truly was a very ugly duckling. The mother duck was alarmed. Was this really her baby? She decided that it must be, and so, even though it was ugly, she tried to love it just as much as her other ducklings. The next day, the mother duck led her family down to the pond. One by one, the ducklings plopped into the water and began to swim. The ugly duckling swam too, thrilled with the pleasure of gliding across the water. On the shore, the other farm birds had gathered to inspect the new arrivals. They were more than a little surprised by what they saw.
Just have a look at that ugly duckling, would you?
From that moment on, everyone in the farmyard was mean to the little duckling because of his looks. They laughed at his big webbed feet and jeered at his clumsy grey body. His brothers and sisters bit him. The chickens pecked him. The other birds simply ignored him. The mother duck wanted to comfort him, but she was so busy looking after all the other ducklings that she had no time. So the poor ugly duckling huddled in a dark corner alone. Nobody likes me. Why do I look so different? He looked out at the meadows that stretched far away, further than he could see. Perhaps somewhere out there was someone who'd be his friend. Early next morning, the ugly duckling set off from the farmyard on his big webbed feet. Across the meadows he went, out into the big wide world. Eventually he reached a marsh where the wild ducks lived.
What sort of funny-looking creature are you?
I'm a farm duck. The wild duck simply laughed at him and flew away. The ugly duckling sighed, but he wasn't about to give up yet. He knew that somewhere out there was a place where he could belong. There must be. Soon his travels brought him to a tumble-down cottage. The old woman who lived there couldn't see very well. She thought he was a goose. She grabbed the duckling and shoved him in a cage.
You lay plenty of goose eggs for me to eat.
Of course, the ugly duckling didn't lay a single goose egg because he wasn't a goose. This made the old woman extremely cross, so she decided to cook him in a pot for her dinner. The ugly duckling was very scared, but he was also smart. So when the old woman opened the cage, he shot between her legs and escaped into the night. The next day, he found himself on the shore of a vast lake. He hid in the reeds, lonely and afraid. He wondered if anyone would ever like him. In the sky above, a flock of the most beautiful birds he'd ever seen passed overhead. They were white swans with long, slender necks and great, graceful wings. As he watched them fly off into the distance, he wished with all his heart that he looked like them. Winter came and the lake froze over. The poor duckling huddled deep in the reeds, shivering. Luckily, a kind farmer found him and took him to shelter in his barn. It was warm and safe there, and at least the cows and horses didn't laugh at him. So when spring eventually returned, he headed towards the lake, hoping that this time he might find a friend. As he arrived at the water's edge, he heard a familiar sound. It was the flock of swans returning from their winter journey. The ugly duckling watched them in admiration. Then as he turned away, a miracle happened. On the surface of the water, he saw his own reflection. To his amazement, he was no longer an ugly duckling. He'd changed into a swan, a beautiful young swan. The other swans flew down to join him. They were delighted to find a new arrival and asked if he'd be their friend. The young bird was thrilled. Of course he would. He followed the others into the lake and proudly glided across the water. The young swan almost burst with happiness. At last he had found where he truly belonged.